everybody. Thank you for being here. It's been a great conference so far. You're about to hear an amazing talk. Wendy is amazing. She's one of my favorite people, and she's going to give you an awesome talk today. Quick couple pieces of housekeeping. Number one, silence your cell phones. We don't want to hear them. You don't want to hear them. Please no recording, because we are recording. No, please don't. You don't need to. Beside that, if there's time for questions at the end, I will come to you with this lovely scepter of questioning, and you will speak into it so that this can go out on the YouTube stream. If there's not time for questions, Wendy will be happy to take your questions off the air, which is to say, out of this room so the next people can come by. With no further ado, the woman you come to see, Wendy Knox Everette.
Sure. Okay. Hi, everyone. You can all hear me? Cool. So I'm going to give a talk that I proposed in May of this year. And I was like, hopefully this is going to be completely irrelevant, and it'll just be like a cool little, interesting on the side. As everybody is aware, that is not actually a situation. There's been a lot of attention paid to this sort of stuff when people are all of a sudden realizing that rights that we thought were pretty well established and our privacy is not as sacrosanct as we had thought. And so I am a fitness tracker user. I had a Fitbit in 2010. I still wear an Apple Watch. I have a Peloton bike. I have a scale at home that talks to Wi-Fi. I've got a bunch of examples in here from my own personal data. And I am a CISO at a startup in the healthcare space. I know a ton about HIPAA, probably far more about HIPAA than I would ever want to know. And I've done some threat models of fitness trackers and so forth over the years, looking at sort of privacy impacts and so forth. And so this talk is going to go through a lot of things. You're going to hear me talk a bunch about data that fitness trackers and so forth collect. And one thing I'm going to actually talk a lot about is that this talk is somewhat irrelevant. Law enforcement is not actually yet using a lot of this data. It's so important that we realize what gets collected and what the protections are. But this has not really been used in any prosecution so far. This talk is a little bit more speculative and to inform people and to have you think about things. I am a lawyer. I am not your lawyer, but I do want you to take one piece of advice away from this, which is do not ever consent to the search of a phone or a computer or anything. Anytime you are pulled over by police or so forth, the one thing you say is, I want to talk to my attorney. I do not consent to the search of this car. I do not consent to the search of this phone. And so as I mentioned, we're going to talk a lot about all the very personal data that your Apple Watch and so forth collect. And it's still not really being used. This obviously could change. Things are very fast moving. I've had to change this talk a couple times over the last 2 days because of things that are happening. But so far it's been all text messages and searches and so forth. So I'm going to do a very little bit on this. I actually did a talk at BSides in 2018 where I went very deep into how warrants work, how wiretaps work, how PRTTs work. And so if you're interested in this, please go find that talk. I'm happy to answer questions about it if you go watch it and you email me or so forth. But I'll just give you a little bit of a flavor of what this is when police are going after those search history and text messages and so forth. So a subpoena is one of the lowest burdens of proof, essentially. But it doesn't give you as much information. It gives you metadata. The Fourth Amendment obviously is written in colonial times, and so they thought about this as well, it's not that private, the addressing information on the outside of an envelope. Everybody can see it. And so if you just want to get to and from information, we shouldn't need that high of a burden of proof. Obviously, anybody who studies stuff like World War II with the Enigma and so forth, you can see that network analysis and so forth will actually give you a ton of information, but we also have computers now to help us with that. But generally, subpoena is a lower standard, less information, less privacy protection. Warrants give you full content, and so there's a higher burden for that. These are mostly what are used if someone's going to get text messages and so forth. And you need to show probable cause that a crime has been committed in order to get this full content data. Related to that, law enforcement has started realizing there's all this cool new tech out there with all this juicy information that they could get. So they've started using keyword warrants, which are very problematic from a civil liberties standpoint. You're not starting with a person. You're saying, I want to find everybody who Googled for like this abortion drug. I want to find everybody who Googled for abortion clinics in a certain state. And so you're basically fishing for your suspects. I am going to tweet out my slides, so there's a lot of URLs and links in here. I am at Wendy CK on Twitter, so you can find the slides after. So if you want to, feel free to take pictures of the slides up here, but I will tweet them. And geofence warrants are also very problematic. These are somewhat similar to the cell site location information warrants. The police have done give me everybody that connected to a particular cell tower. So sometimes they're pulling it from that. Sometimes they're asking Google for people who are in a certain area. These were used a lot in the January 6th prosecution, who connected to certain Wi-Fi endpoints within the Capitol building and so forth. Also problematic from a civil liberties standpoint, because you're not starting with a suspect. You're like, let me throw out a digital phishing net and see what sort of suspects might come up in it. And wiretaps, which is what I have the most legal experience with, are very similar to warrants for stored content, in that you get the full content from them. The federal wiretap statutes say wiretaps can only be used for certain crimes. If you go look that up, it's a huge laundry list of crimes. There's a lot in there. And D orders are something else that I have a ton of experience with. This is basically subscriber information. So you can say, I'm going to do a subpoena to get the to and from for a communication, and I'm going to do a D order for the subscriber information from that. And basically, they will do hops along a network to see who's talking to who and who these people actually are. Google is one of the companies that tries to be pretty open about what sort of data they provide. You can go to the Google Transparency Report Center, and they tell you for all these various types of law enforcement orders that I just walked through exactly what sort of information they're going to hand over. All of that is kind of cool. I'm a bit of a wiretap nerd because I worked on them and whatever. I gotta say, a lot of what's happening has nothing to do with wiretaps. They don't take the time to get warrants. They capture cell phones, and they ask for permission to search the cell phone, and then they take your cell phone and do forensic analysis on it. There's a lot of tools out there that will basically take phones and extract text messages, extract your location history. I am not an expert on this stuff. There's a lot of people around who are. My friend Rihanna wrote a really great op-ed in The Hill recently talking about how the federal government really wants to be serious about helping to protect women. They could say that federal law enforcement will not help with these cell phone digital forensics searches, because right now this is pretty much happening. And so, as I mentioned, people will get the cell phones and ask for consent to search it. And so consent bypasses all of the probable cause and other protections that are in place for warrants and wiretaps and so forth. So very much do not ever consent to a search of a device. Even if you are positive you are innocent, just do not consent. Okay, so I promised we're going to talk about fitness trackers, and I've just been talking to you about warrants and keywords and so forth. So anytime we talk about fitness trackers and health, people go, well, the US has vertical sector privacy, and health is actually one of the areas where we have a vertical sector privacy law called HIPAA. HIPAA does not stand for like health information privacy or whatever. It stands for Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. Originally had nothing really to do with privacy. There have been some add-ons with high tech and so forth. So I'm going to go very lightly over this. It protects information that originates from doctors, from hospitals, from insurance companies, and so forth. It imposes some very minimal security requirements. So I tell my dev team, we need to do this for HIPAA, but we really need to do this to be secure. Like, the HIPAA requirements are pretty low-key. It has a bunch of administrative and technical safeguards in place, like your stuff has to be encrypted. Oh dear.
So we had a outrageous speaker request for all the hugs.
Oh.
So we formed a hug squad.
Oh, amazing.
Ready?
Hug squad?
Everybody. Subpoena. Hold Subpoena.
Oh. That was the best. Oh my gosh. Thank you. talking about HIPAA and getting a hub squad is maybe the bestest. Cool. So why does all this matter? What use is HIPAA? HIPAA really is to protect your health information so that if you work at a hospital and you have access to medical records, you can't just go spelunking through the medical records to see, does my neighbor have a particular disease? Why was a celebrity in the hospital? You can only access HIPAA protected health information if you're authorized to access it, aka you're providing care, so forth. There are a ton of exceptions in there around law enforcement, though. So since we just talked about warrants and wiretaps, we'll go quickly through some of these. These are all on the HHS website if you want to go look at them in more detail. So you can just get a subpoena for this information like we talked about to identify or locate a fugitive, to basically give over information about a victim of a crime to help prosecute it. To alert law enforcement that maybe someone was assaulted and they've died, and so now it's a murder suspect or murder investigation. In good faith, if you think a crime has occurred at the hospital. There's also a huge exception for protecting the president. So if someone goes to a doctor and says, I want to shoot the president, they're allowed to go alert Secret Service, that sort of stuff. And HHS has recently released some guidance around disclosures around reproductive care. That essentially says if you're a nurse and you suspect someone had a miscarriage that's suspicious, you can't just on your own go and report this to the police. However, there is still all the law enforcement exceptions in place, so it is still valid under HIPAA for basically law enforcement to send a warrant to a hospital to ask for information if they think it's a crime in that area. So, is all our fitness tracker data, like the Fitbit and the Apple Watch or whatever, protected by this great set of protections? No. Basically, fitness tracker information is created by us, and we are not covered entities, and so therefore HIPAA is pretty much off to the side. So it's a nice vertical sector privacy law that gives some safeguards, do not apply to fitness tracker data almost always. There's some exceptions, like if you have a pacemaker, or you're wearing an insulin pump or something, under a doctor's orders, the information from that is still under HIPAA, but not your Fitbit or your Apple Watch. So what is a fitness tracker these days? Like we say, oh, a Fitbit, that's certainly one. That's sort of the classic fitness tracker. My watch tracks, oxygen saturation, my heartbeat, and so forth. My phone, if you keep your phone in your pocket while you're walking around, it will keep track of how often are both your feet on the ground, how fast you go up and down stairs. I have this scale at home, and it reports all sorts of stuff up into the cloud for me. I have a Peloton because I also stopped going to the gym during the pandemic, and I have one of these, and it talks to Apple Health and Google Fit. So the fitness trackers know a lot about body attributes about us, it's our heart rate and so forth. They also know some other stuff that law enforcement might be interested in. Where you were is a really big one. And so this is not actually an example from a fitness tracker, but I thought this was a nice tweet that sort of summed up. This is from the recent thing where the Tim Hortons app in Canada got in trouble for tracking when people were coming and going from work and from home. And so this is a sort of information that's just available on your phone if you have an app and you've given the app location access. There's also a really famous example in this area of Strava leaking the private military bases. People would scroll around on the map and be looking at these really empty, desolate areas in the Middle East and go, why is there a little square with a whole bunch of people running? And it turns out those were secret forces bases. And they absolutely did not intend to do this. They're very smart people, but they're not, engineers, and they didn't maybe notice that this stuff was by default public. One that was very disturbing to me is one that just came out somewhat recently. Strava's flyby. They're like, well, okay, part of the problem with leaking the military bases was that you could see stuff that wasn't close to you, so we'll make sure that all the location stuff is near you, so if you run past someone, maybe you want to find out what their running route is. It turns out a lot of people start and end their runs at their home, so you could find someone's home address by running near them. They didn't really learn anything from all of this. They made some default privacy changes, saying you'd have to upload runs nearby. This is from June. I just had to pull this after I submitted this talk because you can upload completely fake fitness data into Strava showing like completely unreasonable times, and it will show you running routes near you, and someone used it to discover a bunch of secret military sites in Israel. So location stuff can be very sensitive if you don't think carefully about how it can be abused. Apple Health also tracks location. They're a little bit more privacy protective. This is from a walk I did near my house, and you can see there is a map. There's not really any way for me to share that map publicly. So it's in my Apple Health. If you use Peloton and you do outside walks with them, they have maps and they will allow you to share it publicly, so it could sort of go through there. But that's not by default public, so it's a little better. But the information is still there if law enforcement, wanted to submit a warrant for it. And fitness tracker stuff is super common for people wanting to track their bike routes and their running routes and so forth. And so there's a lot of stuff on the websites for these tools that explain to you how to turn it on, how do I use this to track things. So in addition to the GPS, as we mentioned, there's a lot of private health information about people's bodies that these trackers have and that they store. One very interesting fitness tracker is the Oura Ring, and they have a temperature sensor in them. I'm sure most of the women in this room know this, but for the guys, your body temperature changes when you ovulate. And so body temperature actually can be a very good indicator of fertility. Are you pregnant? Are you not? It's different for every woman, but overall. And so when I was talking about this with some friends, they're like, oh, but Oura, sure, they're tracking your temperature, but you have to very carefully take your temperature if you're trying to get pregnant. It's probably not accurate enough. It's not really a real risk. So Oura is like, oh no, here's how you can use it to track if you're ovulating. Let us tell you how you do it. Let us even give you some scientific studies to show exactly how precise it is. So as I said, I don't think anybody's actually using this in court so far, but if you wanted to bring this evidence in, Oura is going to help you authenticate that data to show possibly, yes, someone actually was ovulating, stopped ovulating, therefore maybe was pregnant. So in addition to just things like Oura trying to guess if you're ovulating or not because of your body temperature, there is a ton of support in these apps for cycle tracking that's a little bit more manual. There was a huge wave of articles in May, June, about should we be using these cycle apps? Should we delete it? Do we need to delete all this data? That can actually have serious health implications for a lot of women who really need to track their cycle. The controversies around these actually even predates what happened in May. This FTC consent order is from January 2021. I can totally talk. Flow was releasing a lot of data to advertisers and not really letting their users know that, like, hey, you're putting this very sensitive information into the app, and we're sending it to advertisers. And Apple Health and Google Fit finally woke up, realized a lot of women use fitness trackers and added cycle tracking just directly as like a primary sort of thing that can be tracked through those platforms. And I think that I took this picture from Google Fit. I actually, looking at it, I don't remember if this is Apple Health or Google Fit, but it's pretty similar between the two of them. You can just go in and enter the data. So I've been tossing around a lot of terms about Apple Health and so forth. These are the four really biggest players in this field, and they all interoperate. So when I ride on my Peloton, I send the data to Apple Health, and then it sends it to Google Fit. So they all have APIs and work, and so your data's kind of replicating out among there. One of the other reasons why these are sort of the big ones in the field is that each one of these also supports a lot of third-party apps. These are things like the Peloton is actually a third-party app in this. Strava is somewhat a third-party app on Fitbit and so forth, and there's tons of other different apps you can get to plug in, like sleep trackers, meditation, so forth. There's also wildly varying quality. This is my favorite Fitbit app. We came across this and we were doing, looking over various apps in the field. This app literally does nothing but put a roach on your Fitbit watch and have it dance around. I at first saw this and I was like, oh, this is like one of those flashlight mobile apps that really steals your contacts. But it appears not to. It actually doesn't ask for very many permissions. It literally just puts a roach on your watch and dance around. But if it wanted to, it could have access to all of your health information. There's a lot of trust that's happening here. And the way that this is governed in the Google Health and Google Fit, Apple Health, so forth, sort of space is through permissions. And there's wildly varying permission models among these. Apple Health is really good in that it gives you the chance to app by app share what data goes. So this is my scale asking for permissions. I'm unsure why my scale needs my body temperature, but I have it turned on because I was too lazy to turn it off. I could individually toggle these off and on. It also allows it so you can see all the stuff. Again, I'm unsure why my scale keeps reporting my height because so far as I know, it doesn't have a laser height measurement, but there I continue to be somewhat short. Google Fit, on the other hand, has much coarser permission sets. So you can basically give it access to like vital health or not, and it's a little harder on app by app to say like yes to temperature, no heart rate. They do, however, give you some really nice ways to delete data if you decide you no longer trust Google Fit, no longer want to use it. They have Google Takeout and a bunch of other stuff, but right from within the app, you can go in and delete a bunch of saved data. And so one of the other nice ways to see all the data that these apps support and that you can save and whatever is to go through their developer notes. So I've spent tons of time going through developer SDKs in the health space and looking at like what could I be storing in this system. So here I can track cervical mucus, which is something that people look at if you're pregnant, if you're trying to become pregnant. This would all be obviously so far self-reported, I believe. You could write an app that attempts to auto-write this. I can report the results of an ovulation test if I wanted to. I can report spotting. If you're looking to prove that someone had a miscarriage, this might be some data that you would want to look at. And Google Fit has an API to read and write it. So one of the other things, in addition to the primary health stores and the third-party apps, is embedded ad libraries, because this is the mobile ecosystem that we live in. And it's actually not often displaying ads to you. Like there are certainly apps that will show you ads. This is much more the app's collecting data and sending it to third parties who then want to use the information to market to you. Apple Health has recently done a bunch of basically UX improvements to surface to you what sort of permissions stuff is going to request. This is the Moody cycle tracker showing you roughly what types of data it's going to collect. This is another one which I cannot remember. Flow. This is Flow showing you what sort of data it's going to collect. And you can see it's a little different. The data linked to you, location and usage and so forth. Here we had a bunch of other stuff that is not linked to you. So this is a much more privacy protective app than this one. And so Flow had the FTC consent decree. It's part of why I went. And I was like, I'm curious what they're showing that they're using. And so you as a user can educate yourself and say like, oh, well, I'm a little concerned about all this data being linked to me and Flow holding it. You know, maybe I'm okay with this being an Apple Health data centers because Apple Health has a really good legal team. They have strong protections. And we're going to actually talk about how Apple Health stores this stuff. But who knows what Flow does? Maybe Flow has a server under a developer's desk plugged in like at their home. Like I am unsure what their security and privacy protections are. HIPAA does not apply, so we're not necessarily even encrypting this stuff. The other one that is not as invasive as ad libraries, but is also somewhat of a problem, is the crash analytics and usage and so forth stuff that you can include in your apps. A lot of developers include third-party things that will basically track how people use the apps or where are errors occurring. They're really good for helping developers make the app better because they give them a lot of useful data. Side effect of that in a health app is that they're going to know what was on essentially the screen where the error happened. Maybe your heart rate spiked really high and it couldn't handle a heart rate of 199 beats per minute, and so therefore you overflowed some field, and so now they have that information also. And so again, this is just an Apple Health app screenshot, sort of showing that it's collecting usage information. And it's linking it to your account, so you can collect it a little bit more anonymously or tied to a particular phone. So we're putting a lot of trust in the companies that hold this stuff. And we think a lot of times in the field about protecting from like hackers, protecting from accidental data breaches and so forth. We don't always think about protecting from the government. Unless you've been in the civil liberties space for a long time, this is a little bit more of a new angle on some of this. And so there's been a lot of talk about, like, what is Microsoft going to do? What is Amazon going to do? And part of the reason why I had to redo this talk this week is, I believe on Monday this came out, there's a teenager in Nebraska who had her mom helped her self-manage an abortion. Her friend went to the police, told them about this. The police came and interviewed her. She scrolled through her phone while they were there. And so the police got a warrant. This came out, I believe, Tuesday? I think I put the slide in on Tuesday. They released the warrant saying, well, we saw them scroll through the phone and we believe there's evidence of a murder in the Facebook messages that she showed us. And they went to Facebook with a warrant for Facebook message data about a murder. And the messages were released, and so the police are saying that this shows that, yes, she did have an abortion. I think they said 24 weeks, which they say is illegal in Nebraska. And so I put this in mostly to show that still we are not really looking at fitness tracker data yet. Like, it's great that we're aware of all of this, and we do need Apple Health and Google Fit and whatever to protect this information if police become interested in it, but that's not even where the fight is right now. The fight is over messages and whatever. But they do have all our health information. And Apple is pretty open about, like Google, what sorts of data they will turn over in response to what sorts of legal requests that come in. Apple's legal process guide, again, that's a link. You're welcome to click on it when I put the slides out. Will give you extensive information about what you would get in return for a warrant and so forth. Apple stores all health data in CloudKit, which is what they use for iCloud. And so it is actually end-to-end encrypted, and it's fairly limited what Apple can actually see. This is very similar to the problem that happened with the Apple versus FBI fight, where the messages were end-to-end encrypted, and Apple's like, we're sorry, we can't give you the plain text of this because we don't have access to it. This is similar to if you use Signal or some other end-to-end encrypted messaging service. And Apple has recently put out some guidance about how they protect users' health data, talking about, it's end-to-end encrypted, we use very high standards of security to protect it, and so forth. Google also put some stuff out saying, yes, we also protect health data. One of the things that Google noted is that Google Fit is a fairly small player in this space, but Google Maps is huge. A lot of people use location history. I actually have location history on my phone. I found it super useful if I want to be like, oh my gosh, I was on vacation in this place. I went to this really great donut shop, and I want to go back when I go back 3 years later. Let me go look roughly at the dates and see where I was. And so I personally have found a lot of use out of it, so I keep it on. But this is, again, you need to think carefully about, should I turn it off for a few days? Should I bring my phone with me? I know people generally recommend, if you are in one of these situations, don't do something weird, like you always use your phone, all of a sudden you don't, because that can look suspicious. But that's a little bit outside the purview of this talk. But so they realize that this location data is very sensitive, and they don't want people to have to make these choices about, do I incriminate myself by not bringing my phone, or incriminate myself by bringing my phone? And so they're, on their end, deleting a lot of location data in sensitive areas. They are basically improving the sort of information that they show you about what the health apps track. So very similar to those Apple Health screenshots that I showed. They're doing some work there too. And they have basically a little blurb about how they push back on overbroad warrants. So I know from my time working in this stuff that there are all kinds of ways that warrants can be goofy, and you can either choose to be like, okay, I'm going to read this as it really should have been and give you the data, or I'm going to reject the entire warrant on a technicality. And so they try to push back a lot of technicalities. that can be very expensive. It's a lot of attorney time, and so Google can do this, but a lot of the smaller folks can't. And also, remember, this data is also in the smaller third-party apps. And so I was like, I wonder if any of them are putting out guidance like Apple and Google just did. It turns out, not really. This is Flow's privacy policy. They note like, hey, we secure your data. And they actually say like, hey, you might not want to delete your data because then our app might not function the way that it's supposed to. Aura Ring has some stuff up where they talk about locations and period protection, whatever. They don't say a lot about what they're going to do in response to warrants that come. Strava also has some stuff up talking about the information that they have. Not really a lot about, hey, what are we going to do if we get a warrant for someone's location information showing that they were near an abortion clinic or not. So as we've been mentioning, a lot of this fitness tracker stuff really is just circumstantial evidence. Was a person pregnant? Are they now not pregnant? Did they go near an abortion clinic? This is not like a text message saying, I went and had an abortion. So one of the things people are concerned about is the states where abortion is illegal after 6 weeks or so, that they will try to find like the date of a woman's last period and use that to prove that, you know, we know an abortion happened and it happened after a certain date that is illegal in this state. And so there is a lot of concern about what they could infer from the fitness tracker data. Again, I have not seen any cases where this has happened yet, but we're also still very early days. One of the scenarios here that people worry about is traveling to another state to have an abortion. So did you go to that state? Were you pregnant when you went to this state? Are you now not pregnant? There's been a lot of speculation about what might happen here, what will happen with crimes across state lines and so forth. Another one is I'm at home and I order mail order pills, or I get a hold of pills some other way and I do a self-managed abortion at home. This is probably where they're going to look for search history. Probably what really seems to be happening in these sort of cases is what happened in Nebraska, where you tell someone that you had a self-managed abortion and they go to the police. So I've seen a lot of stuff out there saying, honestly, the best advice here is to think very carefully about who you trust and who you talk to. And again, this tends to be search history and text message or Facebook message sort of stuff. So a lot of this, like in all things in computer security, comes down to it depends. What is your risk model? I am still using fitness trackers. I'm also extremely lucky to live in Washington State, and I'm a very privileged person where I could up and fly to other states, or I could probably go to Canada very easily. If you are a teenager living in Texas or so forth, you're in a very different situation than I'm in. And one of the things that's very scary with these is pretty much any woman could be subject to an ectopic pregnancy if they accidentally got pregnant. And those are always fatal if they are not handled, and there's a lot of state abortion bans that are trying to include these. So this is not an OPSEC talk, but I'll throw a little bit in here. New York Times had a fairly good article that was written, mostly to a general public that talks about a handful of things like turning off location sharing. Although again, think carefully about turning it off just for 2 days. Resetting mobile tracking IDs on your phone so that you can't necessarily be tracked across all these different apps. Telling Google to just never store location history and so forth. There's a group called Digital Defense Fund that does amazing work here. If you're interested in this stuff, they are really who you want to talk to and read their guidance. They have a wonderful abortion privacy link up on their website, and this is a really great graphic that they made and talks about all kinds of ways to protect yourself. Like, these are the experts. I know about HIPAA and I know somewhat about threat modeling fitness trackers. I am not an abortion privacy person. I mean, I guess maybe I kind of am since I'm giving this talk, but not really. These are the experts. This is who you really want to go talk to. And these folks have done some vetting of period tracking apps, and I went and looked at them, and I agree these are probably your best bet if you need to use a period tracker, because they're not tracking that much and they're very privacy protective. So like Apple Health is end-to-end encrypted, and you have Apple's attorneys. And some of these are tracking just locally, not syncing it into a cloud. So if you want to use one, those are pretty good options. But again, really, this fitness tracker stuff is kind of cool. As a privacy nerd, it's interesting to look at, but this is not where the real threat is. The threat is text messages and so forth. And they're looking at search history. So throw up a couple resources. These are people who are actually experts in this. Kendra, Maggie, and Emma did a really nice Medium post, Fear, Uncertainty, and Period Trackers, that really goes through a lot of this, and they have sort of a follow-up talking about how period trackers could be used to try to prove women are pregnant. It's great. And so that is my talk. I think I have some time for questions. Cool, okay, and somewhere around there is a mic. Oh. All right. If you ask a question, if I can't hear it, I'll ask you to come up closer to me and I will try to repeat it. So who has one? Okay, the question was, I talk a lot about end-to-end encryption as a way that companies can protect user privacy. And there's a question, are there any laws about that? Like he said specifically about deleting data. Oh, wow, that is the can of worms that I somewhat was avoiding here. If you work in this space, you're probably aware there's a lot of push to say that law enforcement has to always be able to get into messages. It sort of comes from the Apple versus FBI fight with terrorism. There's a lot of concerns about CSAM, child sexual abuse material, and so forth. These are very legitimate concerns. They still have very far-ranging privacy issues. And obviously, if you have end-to-end encryption that is intentionally broken by law enforcement, that is, in my definition, no longer end-to-end encrypted. I do not trust law enforcement to keep whatever escrow keys they use private. You can all go read about Matt Blaze's fun with the Clipper chip. I'm a huge fan of encryption history. So yeah, well, that is a huge policy sort of fight that is happening in the US and UK and in Australia, and I have given talks on it. I'm not an expert on that. Write to your senators and tell them we still need end-to-end encryption because it does more good than harm. So the comment was that you can just not collect data. So those period trackers that I showed, at least Yuki and Drip sort of take that approach. That is very hard in our ad-driven ecosystem. I spent many years at Amazon as a developer working on personalization and recommendations. I'm well aware of the business need to collect a lot of information. It is such an uphill fight. There are people who try to fight that. I use uBlock Origin in my browser, which blocks a lot of stuff, and I still get ads following me around the internet. And I'm like, okay, come on, I'm using Chrome with this ad blocker. Why do I see the same pair of shoes on every ad, or forced into my Facebook feed or on Instagram and so forth? So yes, but I really don't like privacy and security advice that sort of puts the fault on users. I prefer policy changes and so forth. And so yes, that's a way to protect us, but it's not a really realistic answer. Any other? Do you have one? No other questions. All right, awesome. Thank you so much for coming to my talk.